Well, the president, the administration, talking about reducing regulations on businesses. In the big picture, Republicans saying there is a bigger picture and they're not doing enough. Let's bring in our panel on this topic. Steve Hayes, senior writer for the Weekly Standard. David Drucker, reporter for Roll Call. And Chris Steyerwalt, Fox News politics editor, digital. This is our special earthquake-proof panel.
The bunker.
The bunker, the guys. Thank you for being here. Steve, what about this, the effort by the president and this announcement today?
Well, anytime the Obama administration is doing anything about regulations that would curtail them, I think it's a good day. But to put this in perspective, the Heritage Foundation did a study in which they found that one-time regulatory compliance costs and the cost of the regulations in the first 6 months of this year would cost about $12 billion. This would save 10. So just in the first half of this year, you're already $2 billion above what this would save. And if you go back and take the long look at this, when you go back and look at the 1950s, the Federal Register, which keeps track of the regulations, was about 11,000 pages in the 1950s. In the last decade, it averaged 70,000 pages, and then last year it was 80,000 pages. That's 50 copies of Leo Tolstoy's War and Peace in federal regulations. If you want the government to be less inefficient, if you want the government to be less intrusive, the government needs to be smaller. You can try to make it more efficient, but it's not going to work. The answer is to make it smaller.
It's always good when you get War and Peace into the panel. David, the Republicans up on the Hill who are reacting to this are saying the big drivers of regulation, the health care law and the Dodd-Frank financial regulations.
Correct, and I think that is the continuing disconnect, is that when the president says things like this, which he has from time to time, Republicans on the Hill go, yeah, but we did health care reform, and we're still writing the regulations for that over a year after it had passed. Same with the Dodd-Frank financial regulatory overhaul. And I think that I don't know if the president and his team don't understand this or if they look at the world a little bit differently. There are two sets of business communities in the U.S. There's Wall Street, which can adjust to pretty much any rule you write, figure out how to deal with it, and profit. And there is the entrepreneurial and business community in the rest of the country, which usually has to pay for any regulation that is started. Now, maybe some of these regulations are necessary and good and they're all going to work out, but the business community has a much different outlook about these regulations than does Wall Street, and that is part of the president's problem as he moves toward for re-election. Is most of the country is concerned that he's gone overboard with these regulations, even though, as you saw from the clip, he said, look, if anything's wrong, but obviously we want clean water and clean air. I suspect he sees most of these regulations like that.
Yeah, Chris, you look at that clip from his Iowa bus tour and that interaction with that farmer, and it's... What do you think of that? I mean, politically.
Well, you know, that's some stuff politicians say when they're out on the trail and they're in a tight spot. You have a farmer, the president's trying to avoid a difficult moment where he gets embarrassed out in a town hall meeting. So he comes up with oh, just call the folks. It's not that big of a deal. You just call them up and you'll see. Unfortunately, Politico did. And then they went through and they did a hilarious, unintentionally, I assume, hilarious piece where they went through. It's like, and then we called here, and then we tried that, and then we called this guy, and then we called over here, and they got bounced around from federal to state, all the way back down to the end where the best that they could get out of the process. 24 hours later, the best that they could get out of a process was a statement from the Agriculture Department that basically said, hey, it's complicated. So that's something that a politician says out on the campaign trail, but when you're the President of the United States, they check your work.
For Democrats, do they look at this as a political move by the administration, Steve, to try to convince the business community that, hey, we hear you ahead of this re-election effort? Are there some, perhaps on Capitol Hill, who say, hey, these regulations are things we signed on to, don't be so quick to get rid of some of this stuff?
That's absolutely the argument you hear from Democrats. I mean, they will say, look at what happened with the crash of 2008. It was a lack of regulation that actually contributed directly to that crash. And I think that's disputable, but that's the argument that you'll hear from them. But if you go back to what the president said to the farmer, I mean, he said don't worry about things that you can't see.
Right.
In fact, as David suggested, some 80% of Dodd-Frank regulations haven't actually been written yet. They've missed their deadlines to have been written. That's a problem. We know that they're coming, so you can't see them, you can't call to check them out, but they're coming. There's no question that they're coming, and even though they're not written, you know, word for word right now, businesses are factoring that into their costs, and those costs are being passed along to consumers. And you know, there was a study from the administration itself that found that regulations can cost up to $1.5 trillion. People have questioned the math on that, but let's say it's half of that. That's a huge drag on an economy that's struggling already.
Does this play politically with folks in Middle America, this effort by the administration, even though Republicans are criticizing it, that it doesn't go far enough or near enough in the big picture? Does it play? Do people say, oh, well, they're doing something?
I think that people will probably be hopeful about it. And I think they'll listen to the president, take him at his word, which I think they should, and they'll say, hey, that sounds like a good idea, let's see what happens. The problem is what actually happens. And I think for the president, he's in a tight spot because he hears people from the business community, from Main Street, that are concerned about this, particularly in states that he won last time, that he might be in trouble with this time. And he doesn't know really what else to tell them, because I think that he believes in government regulations. He thinks they're a good thing. And so what else does he tell them? But if he doesn't really believe it, my point, then what is he actually going to do about it from this point of view? I don't think much.
I suspect most voters will never hear a word about this. They put it in the Wall Street Journal for a reason and not USA Today. This is aimed at the business community, donors in the business community, people who the president wants on his team. This is a sop to them. All the regulations Steve talked about coming down heavy. These folks are anxious. This is an olive branch from the administration to on the East Coast folks, the Wall Street folks, other folks, that they're listening and trying to do something about it. But I think in terms of actual voter impact, this is nil.
Doesn't move the needle approval rating or all
Golly
that.
gosh, talking about milk regulations, I don't think so.
Next up, Libya and the prospect of Islamic extremism, weapons on the loose. We'll analyze that with the panel next.